Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The area in northern Syria, just south of the Turkish border, has in recent weeks been the focus of friction as fighters and refugees move in and out of embattled spots in Idlib province. While Moscow is in full support of Damascus, it is also negotiating with Ankara to find some interim solution. Here to talk about this military, diplomatic, and humanitarian crisis are Colonel Reuven Ben Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and associate at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, as well as the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader update on the latest developments pertaining to the Turkish issue. Most challenging, of course, is the Syria front.
Well, we've been talking in geographical terms, Turkey, Syria, Moscow, Ankara. It all comes down to personalities, to President Erdogan, to President Bashar al-Assad, and to President Putin, who probably is calling the shots here. Now, Bashar al-Assad has vowed to finish the Syrian civil conflict, whatever it takes. Idlib is the last spot to be taken care of. Obviously, when his operations are being undertaken there, hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million already, and perhaps up to 3.5 million civilians are fleeing Idlib, and the only way they have to go, the only direction, is north towards Turkey. For Turkey, it's a crucial, a critical issue to avoid giving those refugees an entry into its land. It already has millions of refugees from the preceding 9 years of this war. It cannot bear the burden of additional refugees, and it threatens the rest of Europe, that it will push those refugees or the extra refugees westward towards other countries. This is where the Russians come in. The Russians are bent on helping Assad stabilize Syria under his control. They also have their own interests, of course, and they are putting pressure on Turkey to allow the Syrian forces to finish their missions. And again, Erdogan is trying to play each power or each array of powers against the other. Up to now, he has tilted towards Moscow and against Washington. Now he is trying to call on the Americans or on the West in general to help him. We have heard Secretary of State Pompeo and Ambassador James Jeffrey come out in statements which are understanding of and empathetic to Turkey. But we haven't seen anything on the ground yet. So we are in for further bloodshed and further misery.
Colonel Ben Shalom will touch on the humanitarian aspect of this and the challenges it poses not only to Turkey but also to Europe later in this program. But I'd like to talk about the military aspect of things, as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been quite vocal about Turkey's red lines, citing the Sochi Accords as well as the Astana agreements that were reached in both 2017 and 2018 as the points of no return, if you will, with regard to the way they want to see things formulate within Syria's Idlib region and other areas of northern Syria. But of course, as Mr. Oren stated correctly, President Bashar al-Assad has persisted in recapturing the entire country and regaining full control of every inch of the territory, something that he's not wavered from for a moment, and seems to get full support from Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian forces who've been backing Assad's forces in the battle to reclaim those territories. Turkey right now is in a precarious position where, on the one hand, it's not in the best ties with Washington, but on the other, in order to defeat the Assad regime, it will most likely have to confront the Russians. And this is not the only arena where the Russians and the Turks are on opposing sides. Libya is also in the picture, where on the one hand you have the Russians supporting the eastern bloc of Sarraj, and you have the eastern bloc, which is also recognized by the United Nations, but at the same time also supported by Turkey. How do you see all this situation evolve, of course, considering the intensity of such a situation where if Turkey and Russia go to war, this will escalate into a regional conflict?
Mm-hmm. I think the main thing we see here is that this is the nature of warfare nowadays. Now, of course, we all know that human nature doesn't change, and Sun Tzu from 2,500 years ago was still right in all his writings. But still, war has changed, and no longer do we have armies clashing, tanks versus tanks, and the winner is the one that captures the other side and raises the flag. This is not true for Israel. This is not true for the United States. It's not true at all. That is not what warfare is these days. It's multidimensional, as our Chief of General Staff, Aviv Kochavi, likes to say, and this is true. It means that you can't even ask me, as a military expert or an ex-officer in the IDF, about the military aspect, because the military aspect is just a small part of this. On the ground, what the big change we see now is from a standoff and a battle of narratives and words. I think what we see now is, yes, it's a military confrontation, and then full invasion, actually, of Turkey into the area. You could call it occupation. That's a problematic word when you use it in Hebrew, but yes, it's definitely a direct clash. I think the Russians are too wise to let it come to a point where it's a clash between Turkey and Russia. Another aspect of the interesting part of modern warfare is that powers use proxies and allies and mercenaries, terms that maybe in the past we would perceive them as something that's not the right thing to do. But that is the way wars are fought these days. And a lot of what is happening in Syria, it's that. So it's multidimensional. I hope we can try to figure out part of the parts of this multidimensional part, but the military aspect of it is full force now. And even though it's full force, I would claim still a small part of the big game at play.
Nevertheless, when we hear President Recep Tayyip Erdogan saying quite clearly, until February, you have until the end of February, before my forces will invade Syria and push back the Assad regime, which is one military against another, of course, significantly diminished because of the years of conflict that it's been embroiled in. But we'll see once again the conservative warfare at play, with Russian backing on the one hand, Turkey being a member of NATO, of course, on the other. Let's see how much NATO will be willing to support Turkey, considering the strained relations between Turkey and NATO over the past few years.
I think what we see leaders doing now, and remember, this is a mistake I make as an Israeli many times, it's seeing people as good guys, bad guys. And of course, as an Israeli now, my tendency would be to talk about the atrocities that Assad is doing and the bad things that Erdogan is doing. But what they are doing is looking out for the interests of their countries and calculating, the game. And I think what Erdogan is doing with these threats about the end of February and everything, it's actually doing what is expected of him now as the leader of Turkey, looking out for his regional interests. What else could he do? Say, oh, you know what? I'm going to pull my forces back from those outposts, and I'm not as powerful as leader as you thought. No, he has to project power, even though I think ultimately he doesn't stand a chance. I think the Syrians, with the backing of the Russians, are going to ultimately win that battle on the ground with the several outposts. We've been seeing convoys, and it's really incredible, the mass of forces coming in there. And it looks like Turkey is taking this very seriously. And yet I think it's just a projection of force. It's not really an expectation that they will be able to win Russia backed or Russia backing the Syrians there. I think it's just still a matter of this clash of narratives and this working of a strategic situation where it's really more looking out for their long-term interests of the region along the border, what Erdogan calls the safe zone.
Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, to what degree, as a Turkish expert, do you see right now the Ankara government being serious about its red lines? Do you see them following through on their threats with regard to pushing back the Syrian regime forces? And on the same tone, to what degree do you see President Erdogan actually have the backing of the people in Turkey, considering all the developments?
Okay, first of all, I would like to emphasize that this brinkmanship policy, from my perspective, is designed for the domestic politics. Since the Turkish armies suffered already high casualties, so Erdogan had to give a real answer. And from their perspective, the Assad army is not a match to the glorious Turkish army that it is backed by the NATO weaponry. Therefore, in order to to demonstrate a power, so Erdogan took the stage, and he made it very clear that there will be an ultimatum. And with this ultimatum, he also won some time in order to negotiate with the Americans in order to get their blessing or if not blessing, but the American armor. And suddenly, Mr. Erdogan remembered that he was a member of NATO. And he's trying to basically use the leverage of NATO vis-a-vis the Russians. Also, James Jeffrey came there, and he said, we have some Turkish martyrs there. And the Turkish press really liked this expression, the martyrs, right? I don't know if all of the Turkish constituency will buy that. Many of the Turkish people are very pissed off that the Turkish army has already struck this Syrian. In this Syrian war theater, and not all the Turkish citizens are supporting this warfare. But from Erdogan's perspective, it's really good, and it's playing in his hands. The most important problem of Mr. Erdogan is economy, and with this kind of a problem, so you can divert people's attention to somewhere else. And when you're pumping this nationalism and extraterritorial military operations, so the people will think that, you know what, we are a strong country, and maybe we should postpone this economic problems to the next month or the other month, and let us not now concentrate on the immediate interests of the Turkish Republic.
Nevertheless, one point that you mentioned is the economy, of course, which is significant. But I hear in the Turkish streets, and I speak to a lot of Turkish people to understand their mind and their perspective of things. I hear a lot of frustration with the Syrian refugees that have been not very easy on the Turkish economy. Of course, when President Erdogan and the AK party came into office in the early 2000s, they really made a significant shift from a country with 20% inflation. In the early 90s, they were able to draw a certain 180-degree shift in a better projection for the economy. Now it seems like it's going down again.
It's going down
and
again.
The ones who are to blame are the Syrian refugees.
Yes.
And as Mr. Owen also stated earlier, those 3.5 million people living in Idlib, living in Idlib might be also crossing the borders. Of course, we hear Germany has been pumping a lot of money, at least 40 million euros at the first stage, and then other installments and pledges in order to erect all kind of humanitarian camps. To what degree is this a concern for Turkey, which seems like legitimate?
Okay, for Mr. Erdogan, the Syrian refugees in the beginning was sort of present because he began to use them as a leverage vis-a-vis the European Union, a very good mechanism to pressure the Europeans. And even now, when the Turkish armed forces occupy some of the portions in northern Syria, they are trying to get all these Syrian refugees in Turkey to these portions in northern Syria, and they will still retain their ability to blackmail the European Union. And Turkey is not, withdrawing from this very important advantage. And regarding your question, the hatred towards the Syrian refugees, it is very real, and we happen to see the results, the immediate results in the Turkish in Istanbul and in Ankara municipal elections, most of the people blamed Erdogan and his mayors that because of their policies, these Syrian refugees occupied and invaded the most important Turkish cities. And when we are speaking about the invasion, it's not only visual presence, right? They are also occupying the job vacancies of the many Turks. And also the rents of the apartments are also rising. So it's, triggering many problems.
Indeed.
Also social problems between neighbors,
Mr. Owen?
A word about NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created in 1949, of course, against the Soviets, the Iron Curtain, and all of that. But another reason was to have traditional enemies inside the group. France and later West Germany, and now, of course, the Republic of Germany, inside. Turkey and Greece were inside, cohabitating, because they had a common enemy, the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, when Turkey invaded northern Cyprus, the rationale put by Washington was, yes, this is an aberration because in Greece they have a military junta, dictatorship, which is against the norm in NATO, which is one reason why Spain under Franco and Portugal under Salazar were not members. And the Cyprus problem is still here, even though Greece is a democracy again. Now what we have is tension between Turkey and Greece, including about islands in the Aegean Sea. The Turkish government, at least ministers, perhaps not Erdogan himself, but ministers are claiming that the Greeks have put battalions on some dozen or 14 islands, which are, of course, close to Turkish coasts. There is a dispute about territorial waters. And all of this means that if NATO has to act by consensus, Greece can veto any help to Turkey. They have other disputes, of course, going back to the July 15 coup. And
so the leverage goes both ways.
Right. So if Turkey wants American help through NATO, it will have to mend its fences with Greece. It's very, very complicated. However, one can see the making of a compromise regarding this security zone or buffer belt, because it has to do with size. Erdogan has spoken up to now about 20 miles, 32 kilometers. This is not sacred. If eventually it goes down to, let's say, 10 miles, and this has not to do with military risk. It is not the range of a gun or a rocket. It has to do with the refugees, to block their movement towards Turkey. So President Putin can formulate a compromise in which the Syrians will agree in principle and for some time, and the Turks will agree to a smaller footprint within Syria, and this will enable them to reach an agreement.
Even though we need to keep in mind that Idlib province is inhabited by a big population of Islamists and jihadists, including Tahrir al-Sham, which is the controlling denominator of that territory, something that the Russians are well aware of, and many Russians fighting in Syria that were killed were because of those organizations, including, of course, Al-Qaeda-linked groups, Jabhat al-Nusra that was transferred to their the organization, the Islamic State, of course, in its all denominators. To what degree do you see the Russians accept that jihadist population being put in a narrow corridor under Turkish protection, regardless of Turkish concerns?
Well, no solution is permanent. We have to, or they have to, solve the current crisis. the Syrians, backed by the Russians, are not going to give up on their military operations against all of these groups you mentioned. And the question has to do not with the fighters, but with the civilians, including the families of these fighters who were moved into Idlib from other parts of Syria. There will have to be a solution, perhaps new camps outside of Idlib, but Assad and Putin are not going to let those resistance forces stay in Idlib. Their families, the civilians, will be able to leave, but not go into Turkey.
Resistance, I'd rather call them jihadist forces.
Those who resist their own forces.
Indeed. Colonel Ben Shalom, the complexities of this battle are vast. Nevertheless, one key ingredient that may escalate the whole situation to an all-out war is miscalculation. We've seen in the past that Turkey has downed Russian fighter jets. We saw just in recent weeks several helicopters being shot down by Turkish-backed forces using Turkish munitions, of course. And all this development may not be looked over by President Putin in the future if, again, a Russian aircraft were to be shot down. Also considering the fact that the Russians are showing a lot of muscle in those territories along the border right now. To what degree do you think that this situation is fragile to the point of no return?
I think all the developments are such that make us understand that there is no ability to predict. Who would imagine that it would turn out this way? Also, we have this tendency to see that the beginning of the 20th century, back then there was chaos and the world powers were carving up the world and inventing new countries. But we are civilized now, right? I mean, now we have these skirmishes, these wars, but countries are countries, borders are borders. So in our mind, we imagine that Syria eventually must go back to what is Syria. But the truth is that that's not the case. We are demonstrating now, humanity has demonstrated that we have not improved in 100 years, and we're still doing the same things. The atrocities are the same atrocities. The wars being fought here are certainly not with a Western mindset of taking into consideration the humanitarian aspects and all that. That's like a byproduct. So the military aspect, the way the war is won here, is such, with such aggression, taking more the calculations of these powerful leaders. And probably Putin is number one in just carrying out his calculations, employing his force, and even making all of us believe that he's so dangerous that if we down 2 Sukhois tomorrow, who knows what's going to happen? He's going to snap. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I think Russia is very, very calculated. I do agree that if a couple of Russian planes will be downed, Russia will exploit that and make it into such a big deal, and they will calculate that in a way that will enable them more aggression or to promote more their interests. So I'm saying both, okay? I'm saying, yes, on the one hand, things could ignite, things could escalate. There's absolutely no way of knowing. It's like when the Americans pulled out, we all said, it's just a few. What do the Americans do in Syria? No, just pulling that out enabled this cascade of events of emboldening Turkey to go in. So actually, every little thing that happens, you don't know what the ramifications are. But still, you have calculated leaders that know what they want. They're not just going to get dragged into something that they don't want.
Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, can Turkey invade Syria and battle the Assad regime forces without Russian consent, considering the fact that, not to forget, the northern border is bordering Russia. Yeah. So if Russia is attacked on the south, the Russians are not going to hold back on the north of Turkey, and suddenly you have a whole new predicament for Turkey to deal with. From
my perspective, Turkey cannot achieve anything in Syria without the American and without the Russian consent. Turkey is very much aware of its limits. I'm aware that the Turkish decision makers are making bombastic, statements. This is something else. This is, for its own domestic politics. But the Turkish decision makers, they do really know what they can do and what they can't do. And in this regard, I don't think that Turkey will achieve something in the field without a Russian consent or without an American consent. And we clearly see now, in order to achieve something, nowadays, Turkey is making a new rapprochement towards the Americans. And the immediate result of this rapprochement is the result of the Gezi Park trials. Recently, Osman Kavala, one of the most important philanthropes in Turkey, who was accused for orchestrating a coup attempt in 2013 with the Gezi Park protests, recently freed from prison, and everyone was expecting that his prison term will be, that he's going to remain in. Yeah, but now what we are seeing that he was freed together with other 8 activists. What I understand from that, this is a good sign vis-a-vis the Americans. Okay, we are doing our homework again. You asked Kavala to be free and his friends. Now we set him free. So please push the Russians so that we can also show our people that we have achieved something.
Where are we heading to? We're drawing near to the end of the program. In short sentence or two?
In short, Turkish foreign policy will continue to act Mr. Erdogan's public relations campaign, and he will do everything in order to be seen as a very powerful leader, even if he's not.
Colonel Ben Shalom?
I think the main issue that we should deal with, the international community should deal with, is not trying to shape the interests of the countries, but more to deal with the catastrophes, the humanitarian catastrophes. And I think the fact that things could unfold as they do now with the humanitarian crisis and hundreds of thousands of people as we speak, and the fact that we accept it as it's a given, it's a byproduct of war. I think that's something we should all take into consideration.
Mr. Owen, is Israel concerned from the north?
No, Israel is not concerned from the Turkish-Russian-Syrian aspect. It is concerned with the Iranian aspect, and Ambassador Jeffrey only a few days ago in a briefing mentioned that Israel is flying at will, attacking Iranian targets. But just to go back for a second to President Erdogan, he's been in power almost 18 years now. He's getting bored. And when he's getting bored, he looks for other fronts, such as Libya. Turkey is overextended. It has to go back to its natural limits.
Well, I think that he's very strategically inclined and is quite aware of every move that his country is taking. Nevertheless, this is all the time that we have for today, so we'll have to discuss this topic in the near future again. I'd like to thank Colonel Ben Shalom, Mr. Owen, and Dr. Cohen Yanarocak for being with us here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.